Chapter 1. From the Ashes. I don't know which sensation I felt first, the crackling of my skin and muscles, the fire behind my eyelids, or the ashen coat of my throat that caused me to retch out a series of coughs. My body, inside and out, was as dry as desert air. Every moment caused 1,000 tears, the cracking of aged sinew and the heaving of my lungs and stomach as my body rebelled against my attempts to move. I had to force my body to move, to blink, to expel the dust from my throat and lungs. I forced my eyes open, but I may as well have kept them closed for all the good it did. I was in darkness, surrounded on all sides by stone. The stone, at least, was familiar, cold, and soothing. I knew it just from its touch, but couldn't sense it. Not in the way I had been able to since my first reincarnation. The joints in my arms and fingers cracked like dry twigs as I moved them around, seeking through dulled sensations for anything I could grasp or maneuver. I was in some fort of box with smooth sides likely of human carving. Dwarves would never considered the craftsmanship up to par, especially when my hands moved up and could find a seam. There was a lid. I was inside a stone box. Was this a coffin? A sarcophagus of some kind? I pushed and struggled with all my might. I should have been able to throw the thing without effort, to will it to move without touching it, or even to slip through the stone and emerge outside of it. But none of my strength or stone sense answered my call. In fact, the only thing that seemed to actually begin working was my dark vision. The blackness inside the sarcophagus gave way to middling grays, allowing me to see the stone confines I was trapped in. I rested for several minutes as my mind worked through the possibilities. I was somewhere new again. My dark vision was returning. My stone sense, at least in the manipulative way I had been used to, was gone. My understanding of stonework was intact, however. That was just something I had learned early on and could simply tell at this point. I inspected the seam carefully from the prone position I was forced into. There were the slightest pinpricks of light and air, likely unnoticed by the person who carved the thing, but glaring mistakes for a dwarf. This was where I could focus my efforts. I gathered my strength, and with weary muscles and bones that ached with the slightest movement, pushed with all my might. The stone lid began to give way. At first it was only by millimeters. Then, after many rests and considerably more effort, inches. The effort bore fruit, and open air rushed into the area, and I could see through a small opening. There was a stone ceiling with vaulted arches several dozen yards above me that met at points that seemed to touch the very heavens. Each stone was meticulously carved with intricately carved details of elaborate patterns, weaving together like vines which spoke to the devotion of the artists who had built the place. There was age in the carvings as well, settled into the very stone as eons seemed to have pockmarked the designs with erosion. My fingers grasped the lip of the stone lids, clutching it with purpose, and I pulled with all my might to force the opening wider. My muscles ached with the effort, and every sinew seemed to burn with its own unique fire that let me know it was waking up from ages of entropy. I had known worse pain in my many lifetimes, but this was unique. It was if all the functions of life were returning to me and my body was screaming with the effort of renewing its life once again. Like a limb gone to sleep and then waking once more, and every sensation sending waves of fire through the body, so was my body waking to the world. Another monumental effort, and the lid slid far enough to the side that I could finally sit up. I forced myself up, my back cracking along every vertebrae. I rested against the wall of the sarcophagus and took in a deep breath. The air around me felt thick with the weight of time. The mausoleum I was inside greeted me with an overwhelming sense of antiquity, as if I'd awakened in a place undisturbed for millennia. The stone walls were etched with the markings of countless years, Faded inscriptions and murals that told tales of a bygone era seemed to remain only just visible enough to speak to the ghost of histories long forgotten. Dim light filtered in through high, narrow windows, their glass long clouded by settled dust, yet still managing to cast a soft, diffused glow across the space. Dust motes danced lazily in the beams of light, cast into the air after I disturbed the long serenity of the palace, with my efforts to free myself. I could hear the echo of my haggard breaths as they bounced off the walls that seemed to have waited for time uncounted for me to return. I turned my head to look around the space. The stone floor was made with uneven stones, each one bearing the imprint of time with cracks and patches of moss peeking through the seams. In the corners of the room stood small altars, draped in tattered remnants of cloth with fading, elaborate designs and colors that must have looked glorious when they were freshly dyed. I took a minute to climb out of the sarcophagus and braced myself against its side as my legs wavered beneath me. I held onto the stone as my muscles slowly got used to holding up the weight of my body once again. It took several minutes before I took my first tentative, shaky steps, while still keeping a firm grip on the lip of the sarcophagus. When I was sure I could stand upright on my own, I took a minute to inspect myself. I was dressed in a metal chest plate, scalloped pauldrons, cuirassier gauntlets, and drakey greaves. A blue gambeson coat with a chain lining and silver trim hung down past my knees from beneath the breastplate. Thick white cotton sleeves covered my arms, and black pants covered my lower half. A thick faded green cotton cloak hung over my shoulders and was clasped in the front, with a simple brass brooch shaped like an 8-pointed star. A dry, cracked leather belt rested around my waist, and an arming sword hung from it, still in its scabbard. Hanging opposite the sword was a Barbuda-styled helmet. Wherever I was, whatever had happened before, I had no memory of it. But I'd been interred as a warrior. Somehow, my equipment had survived, though it had been worn from natural degradation. I would need to test it to find if it was still reliably functional later. A cursory inspection of the armor and sword made me confident enough that they would survive a few fights if they had to, but I didn't want to have to put that to the test. I removed my gauntlets, eager to give my hands some air, and the sight that greeted me sent a wave of nausea through my empty stomach. My hands were skeletal, with paper-thin gray skin stretched over the bones. I pulled my sleeves up over my arms to find that the state of rot was the same there as it was on my hands. I hobbled over to one of the windows and wiped the dust away to look at my reflection. My face was gaunt, with sunken cheeks, shriveled lips, and sunken eyes. My hair was dry and almost straw-like in appearance. Its vibrant red faded to a dull, rust-like color. The only thing that remained vibrant were my eyes, which were still bright and shimmered with their slight, blue light. What hath happened to mine body? My voice croaked. I reached up and grabbed my throat, not simply because my voice sounded like it was arid and hoarse, but also because of the manner of my speech. It had come so naturally, but hearing it, letting it register, surprised me. I focused on the world outside the window and could see nothing but gray skies and swirling clouds. Infinite emptiness was truly all that greeted me. "What sort of world hath I come upon?" I whispered, the phrasing still catching me off guard. I turned to face the entrance. 2 large wooden doors that stood nearly as tall as the ceiling looked before me. Time to make myself known to the world. I put my gauntlets back on, then moved to the doors, my stride growing ever more sure with each step. I stood before them, looking up, and tried to imagine what might await me when they opened. I braced my hands on the doors and pressed forward, opening them slowly and allowing the cloud-muddled light to stab into the building for the first time in who knows how long. As I stepped through the doors, I was greeted with a patchy cobblestone path that wrapped its way down a series of stepped hillocks. The area was a narrow area of earth and craggy stone only a few dozen yards in width, ending in an infinite drop of smoky grayness. What little vegetation that bespeckled the area was dry and seemed to be caught in the middle of dying out. Why doth this feel so familiar? I asked myself as I made my way down the path. At the bottom of the path was a long rope bridge, spanning a wide gap between the small island I had woken on and another with high stone walls that had crumbled in on themselves over time, but were still high enough to block my view of what was beyond them. The wind that churned the clouds in the gray expanse didn't seem to touch the bridge, which hung still and lifeless before me. Nothing ventured. I sighed and stepped out onto the rope ladder. To my surprise, it held firmly, the blanks and ropes going taut as if new. Still, I had no real faith in the thing and took my time crossing it, tightly holding onto the ropes the entire way. As I stepped past the walls on the other side, the area opened up to reveal a circular graveyard, with markers taking up small sections along the outskirts of the place. I arched a brow as an uneasy feeling came over me, not liking the look of the place one bit. I reached down to unclasp my helmet from my belt and slipped it on, making sure it was fastened down properly. I drew my sword and carefully made my way toward the center of the yard. Just as I was beginning to think myself paranoid, a massive monstrosity leapt over the wall and came crashing down a few yards in front of me. The creature had multiple heads with faces stretched out to unnatural length, with fingers and toes where its teeth should have been. Its eyes were weeping pits of tar, and its bulbous body skittered around on dozens of arms and legs. Several twisted appendages held aloft different bladed weapons. Its largest head focused on me and roared inky, spittle spraying forth as it bellowed. "What manner of beast art thou?" I hissed as I turned my side to the creature to make myself a thinner target, and raised my sword up in a defensive stance. The thing simply roared in response and dashed forward, sweeping 3 blades at me in a devastating horizontal swipe. I've handled a sword since my first reincarnation, and have trained with some of the most skilled warriors in fiction. I am not unskilled in the ways of combat. I stepped back from the swing, parrying one of the blades to send the arm wielding it flying up. I dashed forward, aiming for a riposte, but the creature seemed to react much faster than I anticipated it could. It jumped back, latching itself to the stone wall with its digging appendages before leaping up and over me. It would have crushed me had I not jumped forward and rolled out of the way. I brought my sword up just in time to let it block a strike from a smaller blade. But this time, I used the momentum of raising the blade to bring it up and over in a fluid slash, taking the offending limb from the creatures in a spray of midnight ichor. The creature roared once again and drove itself at me, swinging in a series of vertical and horizontal slashes that I mostly managed to dodge and parry. A surprise lunge caught me off guard, and one of its blades bit into my hip. A ragged hiss escaped me as the blade pierced me and quickly withdrew. I growled in an attempt to push the pain aside. A cut to the hip would hinder my movement more so than it already was with my weaker legs. The creature seemed to sense the new weakness and capitalized on it, issuing a series of attacks that required me to sidestep and backpedal, working the injured hip quickly. I did my best to give as much as I got, pushing forward with a quick diagonal slash that I followed up with what might have been an effective shoulder ram, had it not been for the creature's extra limbs, which caught me and held me by the hair, shoulders, and arms. I hadn't considered that it might grab me at several points. It snatched the wrist of my sword hand and twisted it hard, causing the bone to snap and forcing me to drop my weapon. I closed my eyes and cried out in pain. When I opened my eyes, fear overtook me as the creature ripped a greatsword out of its back and held it in the air with the point aiming directly toward me. Its arms twisted me back more, eliciting a grunt of pain from me and bending me back before driving the great sword down through my breastplate and into my chest. I could feel the blade rip through my heart and spine behind it. The creature wrenched the sword out of me and released me to fall to my knees. My blood spilled onto the ground, and I could feel my life force ebbing away. I had died too many times at this point to be scared, but the sting of defeat ate away at me as I fell into the dirt. If I ever returned to find this creature, I prayed I would have my abilities once more. I swore I would make its death slow and unimaginable. The darkness of death overtook me once more, and I was at peace. My eyes snapped open, and I let out a ragged cough into a patch of green grass. Fresh air rushed into my lungs, and a cool breeze caressed my cheek. I pushed myself up with a grunt and moved to my knees. A fire crackled to my side, and as I turned to look at it, I found a man dressed in a simple cloth outfit and draped in a brown cloak sitting across from me. He was young, likely in his early 20s, with dark brown hair and a beard that was long enough to braid. His green eyes were pale, as if he were blind, but he stared at me and followed my movements easily enough. "Thou awakenst finally, Ashen," he said, his voice calm and undisturbed by my deathly appearance. "What happened to me?" I asked as I checked my body and armor for wounds that were no longer there. "I did battle with a great beast, and it took mine life. I am sure of it." He nodded in understanding. "'Tis true, it did. But thine spirit was too strong. It could not keep you contained in thy prison any longer. Thou hast been freed, and may now see thine purpose." "Purpose?" I echoed as I shifted to sit in the grass. "What purpose? Who art thou, and dost thou know of mine plight?" "I am called Graup," he replied, with a subtle bow of his head. "I rank amongst the Ashen Wardens. Mine duty is to find mine destined Ashen, and guide them to their destiny." I considered what he said. He called me Ashen. Something told me that this was a title or a descriptor, since he claimed to belong to a ground called the Ashen Wardens. If he was here when I woke up and was not disturbed by my appearance, then he was clearly here for me. "You call me Ashen," I said with caution. "Am I to believe that you think me to be your Ashen?" "I know it," Graup replied with soft smile. "How know you this?" I asked curiously. Graup pointed to his eyes. "Ashen Wardens see not but ash and decay, save for when their Ashen is nearby. Only then do we see the world as it truly is. Our Ashen brings the light of the world back to us, and we can see them clearly. I see thee, and I see the color of the world around thee." "I must seem a disappointment to thine eyes," I sighed as I looked at my gauntleted hands. "To be so bound to a visage as ghoulish as mine own." Graup chuckled and smiled, the expression one a parent would give a child when they knew something the child didn't. "Thy visage will be restored the more thou growest in power. The flame of thine soul will renew thy body, so long as thou continue to push thyself to ever greater heights." I stared at my hands for some time, before looking at Graup. "I will be mine self again?" "Thou art further along than most Ashen who free themselves already," Graup replied and pointed at me. "Thine eyes shine like stars. It speaks to the power of thine soul, and the potential thou hast. It gives me great faith in thee." I looked back at my hands once more as I settled on something more disturbing than my appearance. I cannot feel mine magic. I am so bound to it that I do not feel truly alive without it. "Magic?" Graupa asked. "Only the most powerful of Ashen can grasp the nature of magic, let alone wield it. If thou were so connected to it before, I would say thou shouldst speak to a dragon. They alone control the arcane spark in this world, and only those whose bloodlines were blessed or cursed by them may wield magic." I sat quietly for some time as the information processed in my mind. I steeled my gaze on Graup. "Where might I find a dragon? Thou will need to renew thyself more before daring to brave those lands," Graup said. "So long as thou doth not allow thine soul's flame to waver, you will get there, eventually." I stared at Graup intensely. "Thou hast said that thine purpose is to guide me to mine destiny." "'Tis true," Graup nodded. "Dost thou mine destiny?" I asked pointedly. Graup looked at me for a few moments as if he were trying to discern the purpose to my question. "I follow the color of the world that thine soul shines for me. And that is the path that leads to mine destiny? I pushed. He nodded. It does. Which way does the color point? I asked curiously. He turned, motioned with his head. The east. And in where are the dragons? I followed up. He smiled and looked at me. Only a single dragon is in the east, Ashen. I smirked. Then east is our direction. And thou may call me Merida. As thou wishes, Merida, Group said, as he pulled a small satchel from his side and set If in front of him. First, however, wouldst thou like breakfast? I would indeed, I smiled, happy to have some semblance of normalcy since this new adventure began.